evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be here tonight, this evening, to speak to you. And I want to thank all of the members of the Leigh family for hosting me so excellently in such a warm way. My topic tonight is, will it be reparative justice or a hostile? It's a question. And let me begin with that historic date in October 2013, when leaders within the Caribbean community, CARICOM, came together in St. Vincent, fashion, a structure, CARICOM reparations campaign. The heads of government had met a couple months earlier in July in Trinidad, made a decision. So we all journeyed to Kingston, St. Vincent to put the whole thing together. And one of the things said at that Kingston gathering was that 21st century was destined to be the century of reparative justice. That we were embarking on a campaign which, in our minds, we would be striving for a worldwide transformation of centuries-old relationships between the Black, brown, and white peoples of the world. Relationships that tragically were and are still based on old but persisting patterns of discrimination, exploitation, inequity, and domination. Relationships that are rooted in centuries of imperialism, colonialism, systemic racial discrimination, African enslavement, and Native genocide. We bear in mind that some 15 billion, the indigenous people of the Caribbean, were exterminated by the European colonizers. We felt that our campaign would be seeking to promote the sort of global justice that the world so desperately needs now. Reparative justice in all of its dimensions. Social justice, economic justice, climate justice, and that we would be striving for the new relationships that would shift the current destructive capitalist economic model towards social, economic, and environmental sustainability. We felt that this was the journey that we were now embarking upon. But even as we were meeting there and elaborating this new vision, this new reparative justice vision, the Right Honorable Theresa Mary May, Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, was conceptualizing and implementing the Conservative government's hostile environment policy. And you guys know more about the hostile environment policy than me. But what we do know is that much damage was done to African people, Black people, our people. And so we know that it was the opposite of reparative justice. We were embarking upon a vision of reparative justice. Somebody else was embarking upon a vision of a hostile environment that did damage to people. And, you know, again, I might be preaching to the choir, but this was not the first instance of a hostile environment policy in Britain. If you read your history, 1596, Queen Elizabeth I was so disturbed by the number of Blackmores in her realm that she addressed a letter to all of the mayors of England, expressing, quote, Her Majesty's pleasure that those kind of people should be sent forth of the land, end of quote. That was 1596. By 1601, she was not satisfied that the mayors had done a good enough job, and so she issued a proclamation that required the expulsion of Blacks as infidels and an economic burden, and went on to secure a German slave trader to actually arrest and deport them, our ancestors. And then during the American War of Independence, when hundreds of Black residents of those colonies joined with the British cause, either because they weren't sure what would happen if the colonies became independent, they weren't sure about their freedom, or because the British had offered them freedom, they joined the British cause, fought for the British cause. Britain lost. Many of those Black and white loyalists migrated to London, where white loyalists were all handsomely rewarded and compensated by the UK government. But the hundreds of Black loyalists were basically denied any compensation. Some of them didn't even receive the back pay that was due to them for fighting in the British Army. They became destitute, and eventually a dole was put together to assist them. They were destitute on the streets of London, and they were offered a dole of 6 pence a day, but on condition that if you accept the dole, you agree to be deported to Sierra Leone. And when some of them refused to agree or refused to accept the dole, the Vagrancy Act was used to arrest and imprison them. And ultimately, hundreds were deported to Sierra Leone. That's the hostile policy. 1990, the race riots beginning in Liverpool and Cardiff. 1948, Liverpool, at the same time that the Windrush was coming, the race riots in Liverpool, directed at Black people. And in 1958, Nottingham and North Kensington. That's the hostile policy in a slightly different form. Between 1968 and the early 1970s, all the immigration review changes in the legislation, making it much more difficult for Black people to enter or remain in the UK. That's the hostile policy. And you know, when we came to learn about this, when we in Barbados came to learn about this hostile policy, we wrote to the Secretary General of CARICOM and made the point that these are our people. They may live in the United Kingdom, but they're our people, and that CARICOM must step forward and represent their interests, and that we must insist that the correct remedy to what had been done to them, the damage that had been done, the correct remedy had to be a reparations remedy. It had to be a remedy in which the crime, the wrong, was acknowledged. Proper apology was made for the wrong that had been done, that a proper commitment to immediately halt the wrongful policies had to be given, and ultimately repair, compensation. The damage had to be repaired. And you know better than me whether what transpired after the wrong was acknowledged was a reparative justice response, or whether it was a response that, in many ways, perpetuated the hostile environment. And when we perpetuate the hostile environment, we create bitterness, create resentment. So the correct response should have been a reparative justice response, as we outlined in our letter. But I was amazed to read one of the English newspapers at the time and to read an article about a Dr. Tony Sewell, chair of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. And he was of the opinion, and I quote him, "The United Kingdom is the beacon to the rest of Europe and the world. The United Kingdom is not institutionally racist. The United Kingdom needs to stop being driven by white guilt." And now it seems to me that that was adding insult, injury. What was required was a reparative, a genuine reparative justice response. Instead, what you seem to get was very opposite of that, calculated to further damage relationships and calculated to create additional bitterness. And so this is the dichotomy. Will it be reparative justice, or will it be a hostile environment? Whenever I meet British and European diplomats, and I speak to them about our campaign for reparations, I try to explain it very simply. I say to them, look, you all have a choice to make. Do you want a future of a relationship with the Black and brown people of this world that is on a proper footing, that is, a relationship of mutual understanding and respect, or do you want a future of bitterness? Because you are not supposed to be our enemies. I mean, most of our tourists in Barbados come from the UK and America. You're our trading partners. You're supposed to be our development partners. And we are saying to you that, look, a tremendous injustice was done to us. And we are asking that that injustice be acknowledged, that you apologize for it, and you make some effort to repair the damage that has been done to us. And if you turn your back on us and refuse to do justice, you are adding insult to injury. And it is going to have implications for our people-to-people relationships going forward. Either it is going to be reparative justice, or it is going to be a hostile environment. And I recall back in 2001 at the UN World Conference Against Racism, as Jackie was speaking, she was really reading a compendium of a number of the resolutions that were passed at that World Conference. That's the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. I know it well because I was deeply involved in crafting a number of those said resolutions, right? But when at that conference, we said to the British and other European delegations that transatlantic slave trade and the system of racialized chattel slavery were crimes against humanity and reparations are due, the British in particular said to us, no, slavery was legal. And so we don't owe you reparations. That's what they said in 2001. Slavery was legal, and so we don't owe you reparations. Now, racialized chattel slavery was never legal. It was always a crime. It was a crime in international law, but even more importantly, it was a crime under the national laws of Britain. And it's practiced in the 17th, 19th century. And I want to spend a little time on this because this is important. It is true that slavery had at some point been brought to the territory of England by the Romans and by continental Europeans. Anglo-Saxons raided England for slaves, and they eventually took over the country in the 5th century. Many Celts and indigenous Britons were enslaved. That situation persisted until the end of the 11th century, when the Normans conquered England. But thereafter, slavery was abolished in England. The Westminster Council effectively abolished slavery in the year 1102, according to the Domesday Book. An extensive survey of England and parts of Wales completed in the 1080s showed that around 10% of the people in the area of London were slaves. By 1080, William the Conqueror banned the sale of slaves to non-Christians, and in 1102, the Ecclesiastical Council of London, the Westminster Council, banned the slave trade within England, decreeing, let no one dare hereafter to engage in the infamous business of selling men like animals. Within a generation, slavery had all but vanished in England, and it was replaced by serfdom. So when England commenced its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade with the voyages of John Hawkins in 1562 to the west coast of Africa, slavery had been abolished for centuries. And in 1562, the criminal law of England, the criminal and civil law of England had developed to the point where the crimes and torts of kidnapping, of rape, of assault and battery, trespass to the person, false imprisonment, etc., were all well established in English law. So if that was the case, where does this notion come from that slavery was legal? Well, it is my duty to tell you that the genesis of that goes back to my country, Barbados. Barbados was colonized by Britain, 1625, 1627, take your pick. Barbados, having British set up their settlement in 1627, Barbados pioneered the sugar revolution. Initially, the labor class were white indentured servants, but by 1640, Barbados pioneered the sugar revolution, the switch to plantation sugar production, which required not just a large capital inputs, but a large labor force. It was deemed that the white indentured labor force was inadequate. And so Barbados turned its eyes to Africa. And by the late 1650s, there had been such an explosion of the sugar industry in Barbados that by the late 1660s, by the beginning of the 1660s, the enslaved African population had outstripped the white population. Barbados, as Sir Hilary Beckles tells you, became the world's first slave society. What does he mean by that? Not that Barbados was the first society that had slavery, but that Barbados was the first society that was built completely on the basis of slavery. Or the economy, the social system, the governing ideology, everything. The first society in human history that was founded completely on slavery, right? And there was an Englishman called Richard Leigh who came to Barbados in the late 1640s. He wrote the first history book about Barbados, a true and exact history of Barbados, published in 1657. And he set out to explain how it is that a minority of whites could control large Black enslaved class. And he said there were three things, there were three keys. One, the whites must have a total monopoly of weapons. No weapon is to come into the hands of blacks. Second, on the different plantations of Barbados, there was a deliberate policy of putting different language groups together so that they could not communicate easily with each other. And number three, he said, impose upon the blacks a system of shock and awe. Those are the words, shock and awe. In other words, you inflict upon them such horrendous violence. You traumatize. That is how you are able to control an enslaved population that is larger than the slave master population. You traumatize them with horrendous violence. He used the word, you know, when the Americans bombed Iraq, they said it was Operation what? No. That term appears in this 1657 True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados by Richard Leigh. So that is how the slave society was built. But as I said, the enslaved Black sector of the society became the dominant sector, and in 1661, the Barbados House of Assembly decided. The Barbados House of Assembly was established in 1639. Right? Barbados House of Assembly in 1661 decided that the time had come to put in place a legislative framework for governing the slave society, governing that mass of enslaved Black people, right? And this is the genesis of the idea that even though slavery doesn't exist in England, slavery can be legal. And I want to quote for you the text of the preamble of the 1661 Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes, 1661. Bear in mind, the way the local colonial House of Assembly works is that it enacts legislation, but then that legislation has to be passed up. It has to be passed on to England within 3 months. And it has to get the stamp of the British monarch to be completed. And that is exactly what happened. But this is what it says, right? And I'm just going to quote quickly. Whereas heretofore, many good laws and ordinances have been made for the governing and regulating and ordering the Negroes, slaves in this island, and sundry punishments appointed to many their misdemeanors, crimes, and offenses. And these former laws being in many clauses imperfect and not fully comprehending the true constitution of this government, in relation of their slaves, their Negroes, and heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous kind of people, to whom, if surely in anything we may extend the legislative power given us of provisionary laws for the benefit and good of this plantation, not being contradictory to the laws of England, there being in all the body of that law, that is the laws of England, no trap to guide us where to walk, nor any rules set us how to govern such slaves, yet we well know by the right rule of reason and order, we are not to leave them to the arbitrary, cruel, and outrageous wills of every evil disposed person, but so far to protect them as we do many other goods and chattels. And also somewhat further as being created men, though without the knowledge of God in the world. All right, so hold on to that there, right? So they go on now to make, that's the preamble. So the preamble is saying, no, the important things about this preamble, right? Number one is that they whatever laws they make cannot be contradictory to the laws of England. So that's the first point, right? Cannot be contradictory. Secondly, they admit that in the laws of England, there's no laws in England to guide you about how to deal with enslaved people, because obviously slavery has long been abolished. So they're saying that they admit we are not supposed to make laws contradictory to England. There are no laws in England to guide us how to deal with slaves, but we're not minded. Right reason and order tells us we have to make laws, right? So on that basis. Now, the other important thing is they refer to these Africans as people. They say they're people, and heathenish, brutish, and uncertain, dangerous kind of people. Then later on, they admit that they being created men, though without the knowledge of God. So they are people, they are men, even though they have no knowledge of God. Now, I want to take you now, that is 1660. That was the initial act. That act was amended between 1661 and 1667. But this is the real one now. In 1688, they passed a new act. They repealed that act. They got rid of that 1661 act. And this is what they said in the new act, entitled An Act for the Governing of Negroes. And I quote, whereas the plantations and estates of this island cannot be fully managed and brought into use without the labor and service of great numbers of Negroes and other slaves. And for as much as the said Negroes and other slaves brought unto the people of this island for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, and savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of our nations. It therefore becomes absolutely necessary that such other constitutions, laws, and orders should be in this island framed and enacted for the good regulating and ordering of them, as may both restrain the disorders, rapines, that's rapes, and inhumanities to which they are naturally prone and inclined. I pause there. So let us compare the two texts. In this text, this later text, there's no mention of them being people. There's no mention of them being men. In this text, they are creatures, they are barbarous, wild, savage creatures who are prone to disorders, rapes, and inhumanities. And in this text, they are saying that because they are these creatures, the laws that exist in England are not suited or applicable to them. And they, the House of Assembly, have the right, therefore, to design a totally new legal regime to impose on these creatures. Now, I want the professional historians to look more closely at these two things, because the notion that, and bear in mind, right, when these acts are passed, these are sent up to England for the approval of the British government, in particular the monarch. The monarch has to approve them. That's part of the legislative process. Now, they were aware that they were not entitled to enact anything that was in contradiction to the laws of England. Now, in England, at that time, it was a crime to enslave, to kidnap, to rape, to mutilate a human being. And I suspect that when they passed the 1661 Act, in which they conceded that these were people, I suspect that in the years thereafter, they began to recognize, look, we are on shaky jurisprudential ground here. We have admitted that these are people, even though people who don't know God, but still people. And in England, it is a crime to do these, what we have imposed on these people who don't know God. It is a crime to impose this on a human being. So I think by 1688, they said, look, let us repeal all of that. We now say they're not people. They are wild and barbarous creatures. And since they're wild and barbarous creatures, the laws that apply to human beings that exist in England don't apply to them. And we therefore are at liberty to design a totally new regime for these creatures. So the whole basis of the idea that slavery is legal is based on the notion that the Africans were not human. Because if they were human beings and you did to them, you kidnapped them, you raped them, you are committing a crime as specified by the laws of Britain. So we, the House of Assembly, we take it upon ourselves to determine that Africans are not human beings, and therefore we have the right to treat them as something other than human beings and to enslave. Now that is when the British representative stands up at the World Conference Against Racism and says, we don't owe reparations because slavery was illegal. And you say that in the 21st century, you are so morally bankrupt that you are saying that you subscribe to the notion that our African ancestors were not human beings. That's what you're telling us, because that's the only way you could suggest that slavery was legal. And I have news for them. I have news for them. So no legislative body can transform human beings into something other than a human being, right? It is a factual absurdity. And there is a principle of law that legislative acts that are factually absurd are null and void. So the reality is, those enactments of the Barbados House of Assembly were invalid. They were null and void because they were based on a factual absurdity. And the importance of the Barbados legislation is that it was copied right across the British Empire. So it was taken to Jamaica, it was taken to Antigua, it was then taken ultimately to South Carolina, and right across the then 13 colonies. So that legislative provision is the center of the whole slavery regime. So slavery was illegal in the national law of Britain, and I dare say of other European countries as well. It was also illegal under international law. Even under the international law of that time, some of the so-called legal scholars try to confuse the issue. Say, oh, slavery was legal under international law. What they mean is serfdom is legal under international law, or benign systems of domestic servile labor. But what was imposed on our ancestors, this racialized chattel slavery, was a different thing altogether. This had never been seen before, where you negate the human essence of human beings, where you subject them to the most horrendous acts of punishment. And I'm in making the point that this racialized chattel slavery was always illegal, both under the domestic law of countries like Britain and also under the system of international law. I'm just going to quote quickly from Dr. Nora Bittman, her classic book, Slavery, Reparations, Time is Now. And she is making the point that, international law, you look at customary law, you look at the legal principles that are common to a large number of systems of national law. When you are trying to tease out what is the international law regime, you look at these different sources. And she makes, and I quote her, I'm just going to quote quickly, quote, so far as Africa is concerned, several African nations or societies did possess systems of servile labor. However, these systems of servile labor can in no way be equated with the genocidal chattel slavery that characterized transatlantic enslavement. The people who are eagerly classified as inner African slaves by European historians intent on denying the claim for reparations were not submitted to the dehumanization that was really constitutive of transatlantic slavery. African so-called slaves did not have their ears cut off. The name of their master was not iron branded on their breasts. Their babies were not killed when bothering the sleep of the mistress. They were not cruelly tortured for minor infractions or roasted alive over several days. And dogs were not trained to drink their blood and nourish off their flesh. The European colonial slave codes defined the status of slaves as movable property and provided for all these atrocities. Such dehumanization was unknown to African societies. The concept and reality of African slavery coincided rather with the meaning of European servile labor or serfdom. Indeed, honest review and research into the available evidence about pre-Ma'afa African quote-unquote slaves shows that a more precise use of terms in the manner of modern historians of pre-capitalist Europe would compel scholars to describe the vast majority of them as serfs. End of quote. So the point I'm making is that slavery was absolutely illegal, both under the national legal systems and under the system of international law. And so when the European powers that be tell us that they don't owe us reparations because slavery was legal, they are adding insult to injury. And our people's eyes have been opened. The history is no longer hidden. Our people know the history. We have produced the nationalist historians who have dug beneath the surface of the colonial historians and the people now know the history. These European governments cannot believe that if they simply stall, that this issue will go away. It is not going to go away. Oh. If they refuse to go the route of reparative justice, they are going to poison people-to-people relations between the Black and brown and white peoples of this world going into the future. They are, in fact, going to create the hostile environment. And but fortunately, you know, this fellow Sewell was saying that British Britain must not be driven by white guilt. Well, fortunately, there are a few signs of white guilt. And this is the encouraging thing. The encouraging thing is that there are, in fact, some signs of white guilt. And that is what is required. White guilt is required. And so, you know, I'm not going to overstate them. But when in 2018, the University of Glasgow stepped forward and said, yes, we were implicated, we apologize, a little sign of white guilt, a welcome sign of white guilt. When earlier this year, the Anglican Church said, we committed a sin, we apologize, sign of white guilt. Some of the families, whether it's the Trevelyan's, the Gladstone, yeah, we understand the deficiencies with what they're doing, but when Sir Richard Drax says, not me, I don't owe you all nothing, at least these families are saying, Sir Richard Drax, the Drax family, at the center of the entire system of slavery in Barbados. Sir James Drax came 18 years old on the first colonization voyage to Barbados, 1627. Sir James Drax, the pioneer of the sugar revolution in Barbados, the pioneer of the switching from white indentured labor to African enslaved labor. You heard about the Willie Lynch letter? How to construct a slave? Yes. And everybody argues over whether it's a hoax. It's not at all. It is factual. Well, you don't have to argue. Sir James Drax's son, Henry Drax, he produced the classic instructions written out in hand of how to run a slave plantation, passed on from generation to generation among the planter class in Barbados. So this family is at the heart of everything to do with slavery. So James Drax migrates to England in the 1650s, taking his wealth with him, buying up properties, luxurious properties all across England. And then his descendant, Sir Richard, the richest man in the House of Commons, says, it's nothing to do with me. That's long ago. That's my ancestor. It's nothing to do with me. So at least these are the families that at least step forward and say, look, we acknowledge our family fortune has its roots in this history, and we apologize, and we make some welcome sign of white guilt. The Netherlands government, last year, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands stepped forward and admitted that his government has been involved in crimes against humanity, that they damage African people, and the damage exists up to today. So some welcome signs of white guilt. But of course, it has to go a lot further. In CARICOM, we have our reparations institutions. We have at the highest level, Committee of Prime Ministers, 6 Prime Ministers, chaired by the Prime Minister of Barbados, our Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations. A little below that, we have the CARICOM Reparations Commission, chaired by Sir Hilary Beckles. And we have looked at what has been happening recently. We are not totally happy because we feel that we have set up these regional bodies and that the reparations process needs to be processed through these regional bodies. So we are not happy with people feeling that they can simply jump up and say, well, we have to absolve their conscience. We did something wrong, and we're going to give you this, and you're going to pick out who you're going to give and all of that. So we are saying no. We are going to put a stop to that. The Prime Ministerial Subcommittee is the regional body that will deal with governments, that will negotiate reparations settlements with governments. The CARICOM Reparations Commission at the lower level will deal with institutions and families and civil society organizations. And you can't unilaterally determine what you're going to pay for reparations. That has to be the product where we sit down and discuss this. And that has to be the product of some mutual agreement. So we plan to impose that kind of order on what is happening now. I also need to make the point that it is going to be critical as well that we decolonize and deconstruct and repair all these perpetrator cultures. This whole culture, you built your wealth, your civilization by losing and plundering Black and brown peoples of the world. But then you arrogate to yourself that we are the model, and we are morally superior, and the rest of you have to aspire to be like us, without acknowledging that your achievement is built on criminality. It's built on defeating and looting and plundering other people. So part of the 2 minutes. Part of the campaign must be we have to deconstruct this world order. This world order, political and is rooted those centuries of enslavement, of colonial domination that has, even up to today, has us inserted in a structurally subservient and exploitative. The reparations must be about reconstructing that whole order and creating those new relationships that I spoke about at the beginning. A new world of mutual respect, of equality, and one that ultimately will be sustainable. The last thing I really wanted to say is that is to make you aware of some of the new developments that are taking place. We feel in CARICOM that we have finally arrived at a global reparations movement. We are at a stage in CARICOM now where we are coming together with Africa. Africa is coming into the reparations campaign. Africa is seeking to partner with CARICOM. Africa is organizing. We have resolved that we are at a stage now where we need to seriously examine all of the possible legal strategies. We know that the success in the reparation campaign is going to be a combination of both legal strategies, political activism, making it a mass movement, cultivating public opinion, world public opinion, but we're going to use the UN system a lot more now. Our reparations claim is not only against Britain. Our reparations claim in the Caribbean is against all countries that are implicated in both native genocide. In 2013, we identified 6 countries: UK, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Denmark. Since then, we have identified 4 others. We identified 4 others. I'm not going to mention their names because we haven't sent off the official letters yet. But we are preparing the 2nd round of letters. 10 letters will soon be going out to 10 of these European heads of government. So for us, we know that truthfully, they can never compensate for this, for all the damage that was done. They can never compensate for those centuries, those multiple generations of people, of our ancestors who were enslaved, who were executed, who starved. I mean, but so they will. A moral debt will always be owed. However, we are saying in the Caribbean that what we can do is that we can address the historical legacies of underdevelopment that are directly linked to the crimes, native genocide, and African. And that is why we have designed this 10-point plan that is based on actually addressing structural underdevelopment, technology and education and healthcare. And the whole idea is that the reparation package should bring our societies to a new, robust, self-generating, self-propelling, autonomous economies and societies. Because of that history, because Europe purchased its development at the price of the systematic looting and plundering and underdevelopment of our people and nations, because of that history, we now have a fundamental right to development. And they are under a fundamental duty to pay for and to facilitate that development. Thank you for this.